So welcome everyone to this session on governing the fair transition. And I am Giulio Mattioli from the TU Dortmund University, Department of Transport Planning. First thing, I need to ask you to mute your mic unless you're speaking, of course. See that all of you are muted right now, and you can use the chat to ask questions at any time. I'm looking at the chat right now, so I can see what you're writing. You can send a private message to Firefly or Tina, who's assisting us. If you need help with anything else, just to remind you that this meeting is being recorded, and we also advise you to close any other programs and windows you might have open and mute your devices, both on screen and nearby. So it's about the structure of this session. We'll have 3 presentations, and then we will have 10 minutes at the end for networking in breakout rooms. You may be familiar with this format already from past 2 days. That can be in breakout rooms or a comfort break. If you need to leave, just leave. So that will be at 3:20. So that was all I had on my list, and I am will then, without further ado, move on to the first presentation by Jillian Anable, who's chair in transport and energy at the Institute for Transport Study at the University of Leeds, and also leading one of CRED's projects on transport, or is it called Spokes? I forgot. Anyway. Gillian Anable will be presenting about some of CRED's findings on excessive energy consumers. Over to you, Gillian.
There we go. Thanks very much, Giulio, and great to see you, by the way. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Very pleased to be presenting this on behalf of my team members in CREDS involved in what we call, for shorthand, the Excess Project. The project is led by Karen Lucas, was with us at the University of Leeds, now at Manchester, and a whole suite of others you can see on the screen. Karen leads the project, and there's lots of people involved doing various different types of activity, whereas I just sort of cheer from the sidelines and hope to be able to give you an accurate representation of the huge amount of work that's gone on in the project. So I'll give you a little bit of background to the project, what it came out of, I guess. Some very brief overview of the conceptual framing, just to give you a sense of what we've been grappling with as everyone in this field around social justice and environmental justice will be doing and has done. But I want to concentrate on just giving you a flavour of some of the results that have come out of the qualitative work in the project. So the focus is on high end use, which I'll talk about, trying to define quickly in a moment. But is that focus indeed the best way to reduce overall energy consumption? That's clearly the question that lies at the heart of this project. We wouldn't have done it if we didn't think maybe there was something in this. I mean, certainly just looking at the maths and the distribution of energy demand, we would get more bang for our buck if we could focus on this high-end consumption segment. But then even within high end, what about the super rich, the very conspicuous levels of consumption that we may define it as, and could we indeed get to those people in a research context in a meaningful way to be revealed? What about addressing excess within the same social and income groups? So is excess just defined quantitatively in terms of the highest end, or is there excess in given locations, in given income groups, in given social segments defined by other means. But the big question at the heart really of the qualitative research that we've undertaken is about how we can actually talk about excess to individuals in terms of what they understand by it, what they accept as being excessive. It's an inherently normative concept. So how do we change the thinking about what is normal and what is acceptable in terms of reductions? What does this all mean then in terms of policy? Now, I don't claim to be able to answer all of those questions, possibly none of them in this presentation, but that's the background to the project. So as I say, defining excess was clearly a starting point for us, and I won't be going into this in any level of detail, even though a huge amount of quantitative effort has certainly gone on behind all of this. So in terms of quantitatively defining excess, as I say, we can look at the top percentage, the top consumers. We can look at different quartile ranges and think about a particular cutoff point above the mean, so many standard deviations above the mean. Or we can look at outliers, as I said before, in any given segment as we define it. But there are, of course, all kinds of other qualitative ways in which we might want to think about excess. This touches on a lot of the conceptual work, as I say, within the social and environmental justice domains about needs versus wants. What is a necessary or a minimum quantity of any given thing, energy or mileage that we might be looking at? And how can we actually justify defining what is unreasonably high? Certainly, there's a lot of work that has gone on, both in terms of the quantification, but in terms of the conceptual mapping of this as a subject area. What we would say to sum this huge body of work up in one sentence is that whilst there has been a lot of work on unequal consumption and trying to define needs and wants and highs and lows, there's still gaps in actually understanding, looking at, examining, understanding and trying to reach high-end consumers in a research setting. So as well as actually quantifying excess, we have used a lot of different conceptual frameworks to try and define the areas of investigation. As I say, I won't go into all of these. We've got a working paper summarising the various different concepts here, both in terms of the human needs versus needs and satisfiers, capability approaches, energy sufficiency approaches, and limitarianism. But overall, in terms of trying to put that work into a framework that we could use to talk to people within in qualitative and quantitative interviews, we've really had to also think about the fact that the energy consumption activities that we would be looking at, that's both travel, by the way, and energy consumption in the home, arises, those demands arise from a whole constellation of things. So whether it's the built environment, the houses, the housing fabric, the tenancy situation, the infrastructures, the devices that people have available to them, as well as the actions that are structuring their choices. So in other words, there are a whole number of demands, as we know, which are potentially discretionary, but a whole other way of looking at demands in terms of what has structured those demands, and may actually give rise to high consumption, maybe even excess consumption by some definition, through no voluntary or discretionary behaviour of the individuals or households concerned. There are discussions along these lines also, so not just thinking about the social justice framing, but also thinking about this very specifically in terms of energy consumption and some of the various sort of more inclusive and interdisciplinary pieces of work that we've looked at and consulted are identified here. So to go on to the interviews, so we've undertaken 30 interviews and 4 deliberative workshops. All of this swathe of qualitative work was preceded by a lot of quantitative area-based analysis. At the LSOA level, that's a small geographical area unit for spatial analysis in the UK. It's roughly about 500 households, 1,500 individuals. Lots of data is available at this scale on energy demands, also on travel demands. So we've used that data to identify areas which have a specific combination. So that combination is where they have high domestic energy consumption, but the statistics tell us that actually the housing stock in that LSOA is ostensibly efficient. So that's using energy performance certificates of housing. So there you have a juxtaposition of or a potential to look at people who are consuming high amounts of domestic energy, but it is potentially not to do with the living in poor housing stock. And then similarly with mileage, we can find areas that overlap with those domestic energy consumption patterns, but also have high car mileage, but ostensibly are in good areas with good accessibility, so potentially have the choice not to use the car. So you have, by the time you overlay those different criteria on the map of the UK, actually there were quite a large number of areas which fit our criteria, but we zoomed in into points around the Northampton, Guildford and North Midlands areas that fit our criteria. So that meant that the sample that we used were all supposedly in newer post-1930 households or high energy performance certificate housing. We had for the recruiters gender, ethnicity and age quotas, and we have obviously got a breakdown of our sample, but I didn't want to detail that with you today. With these individuals, we wanted to really dig around in people's understanding of their social norms, where they saw themselves fitting in terms of their energy consumption relative to others, and what they perceived others around them to be doing in comparison to themselves. We wanted to look at what role these systemic factors, cultural norms, played in their energy consumption, and how and why people consume what they do from their own rationales, using their own language, obviously. The literature review helped us then create a coding frame, a set of deductive codes, huge breadths of codes. This is just a subsample, although you have the top codes outlined there. Each one of those parent codes produced another folder of inductive codes, which grew and grew through the coding. So this is just to provide you with an example of the sort of breadth of types of parent codes and subcodes that we came up with. What I'm going to do now is go through some areas of findings. Each of these slides has some quotes for you on the right hand side, which I'm not going to read out. I just want to summarize some of the areas as we've conceptualized them. So firstly, looking at drivers of energy consumption. And the first sort of area that we've captured is this idea of what it means to be living a modern life, or what modern life actually consists of. So certainly flying and foreign holidays came up consistently under this idea of what is expected and normal in this modern lifestyle. Multiple cars, TVs, computers, freezers, but also very specific lexicon around the type of kit that is expected or desired in houses, or seen to be the norm in this kind of social strata. So L-shaped in particular, kitchens with islands and extensions, American style fridges, 5-ringed hobs, air fryers, vinidors, which I had to have Noel Cass, who did this research, define for me. They're specific wine fridges, in case you didn't know, and multiple appliances. And some of the language around this is really especially interesting, as it appeared to come from experiences, such as experiences gained externally in visiting restaurants, in visiting other countries in particular. Yeah, so migration of these expectations from work or other environments. So offices have provided people with expectations around coffee machines, what their internet should be like, air conditioners, printers, double screens but double monitors, guilty as charged. Influences from restaurants, so air fryers, hobs, coffee machines. Influences from people that are in and around the household and employed around the household, and expectations that they bring with them. The careers in practices, and devices. So the idea that certain practices, such as the school journey and school choice, everything wrapped up with that school practice, has in itself generated a culture of school children around mobile phones, that being the new norm for children. Also around children, TV, gaming, expectations of having a full gaming cave or equipment, having constant online availability of entertainment. And of course, a lot of expectations actually being driven by the teenagers themselves, as being expected. Middle-class childhood is also, though, potentially a key driver in terms of aspirations, investments, parents wanting to give children either what they had or what they didn't have, and many of the activities around the school and socialising around teenagers being car dependent. A lot of language which is around the location where people live, where they desire to live, and certain types of expectations. So leafy areas, proximity of train stations, and accessibility to high street shops, even though people didn't necessarily use them, they expected those to be around. And then lots and lots of other findings around drivers of consumption. So location specific factors, sizes, expectations around particular sizes of space available, the income assets driven potential around ownership of property and location, aspirations for equivalent types of standards of living, albeit perhaps in different locations during retirement, that coming itself with expectations around travel, and lots and lots of different aspects about what is considered to be a good life. Also lots of discursive strategies around the environment. The environment didn't tend to come up bottom up. It was brought into the conversation by and large, as other people would have experienced, I'm sure. But the idea being that people are benchmark themselves against doing better, or at least as well as, if not better than others. But that idea of what they're doing on that's just as much as others is related to light bulbs, some very specific behaviours in the house, recycling, and paying attention to product packaging, etc. But also the idea that, sorry, I thought there was another slide there, the idea that high-tech solutions, i.e. More efficient products, is equal to being proactive around the environment. There are separations of where, though, consumption happens, and whether or not the environment actually pertains to those different consumption areas. So holidays are protected in terms of the degree to which they seem to have the need to pay attention to environmental factors. If you're efficient about the way you do something, as I say, it doesn't matter how much of it you do. And lots of the discourse around energy efficiency and how that's actually sold to people has crept into everyday discourses. So I'm just going to, I'm realising, just to finish off, to tell you that we have also undertaken 4 deliberative workshops that they have just finished, so we don't have many results from those yet. 3 hours each, similar kind of recruitment process, but splitting up the workshops in order to mix high, low types of energy consumption. So figuring that would actually generate some different debates and obviously different characteristics. The idea here was, though, very specifically, unlike the interviews, to really explore the topic of fairness. So what is it that people will consider to be a reasonable level of energy using activities and reasonable approaches to changing those? And we limited, or we structured the discussion with people around some very specific policies. So structural changes, incentives, rationing, and smarter choices and more softer information and persuasional type of interventions, and structured the conversation around fairness and effectiveness of those. So the results for that, as I say, are really too early probably to give here, but we're not able to actually conclude as to whether the focus on high-end use is the best way to reduce overall energy consumption quite yet. We will filter through the results, but it is a topic, it is a question, if you like, that I think would be really useful if we could discuss that as we go through later into this session. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Jillian. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for asking. And we'll now have to move to the next presentation by Mari and Neil. So Mari Martishkainen is a Senior Research Fellow at the Science Policy Research Unit and the Sussex Energy Group, of which she's also co-director both at the University of Sussex, and she's leading one of CRED's projects, and Neil Simcock is lecturer in geography at Liverpool John Moores University. Please, over to you guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Giulio. Right, let's share this. Does that look all right to everyone? I hope it does. So, thanks for inviting us to come along. And I noticed that Greg Marsden was in the audience. So specific thank you to Greg, because he asked us to submit something for this conference. So just a quick disclaimer, it's my first ever transport conference. I'm an energy researcher. So if I use language that is not quite correct to you, then please, give me feedback later on. And also really thank you to Jillian for brilliant presentation on the Access project. We are looking at the kind of the total other opposite of energy and transport sort of consumption. So our sort of presentation will focus on the double energy vulnerability in the UK's low carbon transition. And this is really coming from our project, which is titled Fuel and Transport Poverty in the UK's Energy Transition. So this is a 3-year project also funded by CREDS, and we are specifically interested in seeing where people might be actually having issues with both fuel poverty and transport poverty. And historically, those two have been sort of, looked at different, sort of from different perspectives and different under different disciplines as well, quite a lot. But Giulio, who is also actually working in our project, another little disclaimer there, he's been leading on this kind of concept of double energy vulnerability, where you might actually be affected by both at the same time. So, so we've done a systematic review of previous research, and Neil will talk about that a little bit more. And we have just finalized our household interviews. So we've done 59 interviews across the UK in all 4 nations with different households. And we still have a lot of spatial analysis and surveys and focus group type work coming up in the last year and a half of the project. So just really quickly to define some key concepts. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the concept of fuel poverty, it really means that someone doesn't have the sort of socially and materially necessitated level of domestic energy service. And this is really nicely actually thinking about now with Jillian's presentation as well, that, you know, I think we all have quite subjective kind of feelings of what is actually a sort of necessary level of an energy service, for example. And in transport poverty, within our project, we think about it in terms of whether you have a socially and again, materially necessitated level of transport service. So this really kind of more simply means, it means affordability. So either your energy and transport costs are too high, so you can't pay your fuel bill, for example, or you can't afford your transport costs, or alternatively then you might have a lack of access. So that could be usually because of infrastructure. So for example, you might live in a really old house that is just impossible to keep warm, or you might just not have any transport links near where you live. So so just really quickly on the key concepts there, and I'll pass over to Neil to talk over the next couple of slides.
Yeah, okay, so in this slide, I'm just going to briefly explain the systematic literature review aspect of the work that Mari talked about. So basically, we undertook a systematic review over a 5-year data period, so between all literature published between 2014 and 2019, using major journal databases. And we did basically separate searches and analysis of energy poverty literature and transport poverty literature, and there was a combined total in the sample of 216 papers. Alongside that, we also did a supplementary narrative review of 34 key papers that fell outside of that date range, basically interesting new papers that were coming out that had fallen outside of our original sort of search range that we wanted to include. So we did a supplementary narrative review as well. And basically the aim of this was firstly to identify the social groups and the geographical settings that are most likely to experience energy poverty and transport poverty separately. And then following that, what we did was we compared the results for energy poverty and transport poverty, and we looked at where are the overlaps, where are the differences, and where we do see similarities, we were sort of assuming that those are going to be the places that were at greater risk of this double energy vulnerability. So the sort of simultaneous experience of transport poverty and domestic energy poverty at the same time. So next slide, please, Mari. Okay, so just to quickly onto some of the results then. So this slide here is considering vulnerabilities categorized by social groups or socio-demographic groups. And the chart there, it's quite small, but hopefully you can make out, it's showing the percentage of articles in the transport poverty and the energy poverty sample that identified a particular socio-demographic group as being vulnerable to that specific problem. So the black bars are for energy poverty and the striped ones are for transport poverty. Won't go into this in too much detail, but basically in both sets of literature, one of the most striking findings, and you see this at the bottom of the chart there, is that having a low income, being in income poverty, is related very frequently to increased vulnerability to both problems. So around about 80% of articles in both samples identified a low income as sort of a key driving factor. And that can be both because of a direct effect of not being able to afford energy and transport costs, but it can also then lead to some knock-on material disadvantages, particularly in terms of energy poverty. So if you're on a low income, you tend to also live in poor quality, less energy efficient housing. You tend to have older second-hand appliances maybe. So that also raises your energy costs as well. Aside from that, most of the categories are identified in both sets of literature. So actually we saw quite a lot of similarity coming out between energy poverty and transport poverty. Sometimes there's differences as well. So one thing you can see there is that older people tend to be identified as vulnerable to energy poverty more frequently than transport poverty, but then younger people seem to be identified as vulnerable to transport poverty, but not so much as energy poverty. I mean, that might reflect something we might expect. Another interesting one is around women and ethnic minorities, which were identified as vulnerable a lot more in the transport poverty literature than they were in the energy poverty one. We're not really clear to what extent that actually reflects it just being under-researched actually in the energy poverty literature, rather than there actually being any sort of major difference there. And then the final point on this as well, which I think is an important one, is that you can see that many of these sort of socio-demographic groups that are identified as vulnerable to transport poverty, energy poverty, are also often at increased risk of exposure to multiple other social and environmental hazards. So, for example, COVID, a lot of the groups we know at risk of COVID are coming up here as well. Things like climate change hazards, air pollution, etc. So really what we would say is that this suggests that vulnerability to energy poverty, transport poverty is not wholly distinctive. In many ways, it actually reflects sort of deeper rooted inequalities in society, especially perhaps in terms of social class and income and wealth inequality. So next slide, please, Maury. Okay, we also looked at the spatial dimension of vulnerability as well, so the geography or the places that were identified as vulnerable most frequently. And whereas in the previous slide I talked a lot about how there were similarities, I think when we look at the geography of it, this is where maybe we start to see more differences between energy poverty and transport poverty, and also variation between national contexts as well. So it's quite complicated. So the table I've got here is really just sort of providing the picture for England, and if you did it for somewhere else, it might look slightly different. So here we could look at, and we can see that people living in urban areas seem to be at a slightly greater risk of energy poverty in comparison to transport poverty. So for energy poverty, you sort of have this combination of low income, high housing costs, and also poor infrastructure and poor quality housing, particularly for low income people that are living in the private rented sector. Whereas for transport poverty, you have the low incomes and the high housing costs, but to some extent that's offset by a more kind of favourable environment. So you have shorter travel distances to services, you have more public transport. For suburban areas, the pattern seems to reverse a bit. So you have stronger vulnerability to transport poverty because you start to see longer travel distances to services, you see less frequent and more fragmented public transport. And for energy poverty, in England at least, or most parts of England, you sort of get a combination of sort of a higher average income and better quality housing. But as I said, if you looked at a different context, say France or even Wales, poverty to some extent there is more suburbanized, so you might get slightly different results. And then finally, rural areas. This seems to be the geographical setting where we found that the most often seem to be overlap between transport poverty and energy poverty. So for both problems, you see that there's a lack of access to networked infrastructure, a lack of access to provisioning services, so what in some literature has been termed spatial peripheralization, which in both cases, this ends up leading to a reliance on more expensive travel, more expensive heating options. And actually, as I said, if you went outside of England, to even Wales or Scotland, for example, you also tend to see higher rates of income poverty in rural areas as well. So these kinds of infrastructural problems are actually further exacerbated in other places. So next slide, please, Mari. Okay, so who are the doubly vulnerable? So this diagram here, this is sort of trying to illustrate the idea conceptually. So the x-axis there is looking at the sort of spatial dimension and increasing peripheralization, meaning exclusion from key infrastructures. And then the y-axis is looking at the socio-demographic dimensions. So you sort of move from a singular socio-demographic vulnerability at the top, and you sort of, as you move down, you sort of move to sort of increasing or multiple vulnerabilities. So being a single parent on a low income with a physical disability, maybe an ethnic minority at the same time, you sort of have these intersecting, compounding disadvantages. But basically the conclusion we came to was that the greatest risk of double energy vulnerability is among households that face a kind of combination of multiple intersecting socio-demographic disadvantages and a high degree of spatial peripheralization. So it means for us that double energy vulnerabilities is going to be most common in national contexts where basically low income marginalized households also tend to be living in rural settings. So in the UK, that means probably parts of Wales, Devon and Cornwall, parts of Scotland as well. Mari, that's it for me. So over to you again.
Thanks, Neil. So Neil explained there really nicely about you know, the kind of what's been happening in previous literature, and then what we basically did in addition is that we interviewed 59 households across the UK in all 4 nations, and And our initial plan for the project changed a little bit because something called COVID hit us kind of quite early on in the project. So our research design was slightly different from what we actually ended up doing. But we interviewed 59 households, and we wanted to really find out about, what does it actually mean if somebody is actually faced with fuel poverty and transport poverty at the same time. And, of course, some people might say that this is all poverty, but thinking back to our sort of original definitions about it being access to, to a certain level of services, it is quite more complex than just thinking about that. Okay, it is just, income poverty in that sense. So, so some of the kind of things that we have found out in terms of our original kind of data collection with the interviews is that there's kind of like two different things that people are faced with. And one of them is prioritizing. And this is really about people having to choose between key services. So, for example, they might have to choose one day whether they heat their home or whether they take the bus to work or the bus to the local hospital, for example, for an appointment. So we heard a lot of people talking about feeding the electricity meter in particular, thinking about how much money goes into the meter, then what money is left over after that. And then also, what can be used for other services, such as particularly transport services. So it's a lot of prioritizing between energy and transport, but also between food and other services. And it's interesting, actually, when Jillian was talking about people wanting to really provide for their kids. In our interviews, we heard people talking about, well, I actually want to really take my kids at least once a month to the local park or to the local restaurant or something like that. So people were aspiring to like really quite basic things that they wanted to provide for their kids. So when I heard from Jillian's sort of data collection, I thought actually those people seem quite greedy in a sense of what we've been hearing from our data collection. And it's in terms of the prioritizing, it's also really budgeted into the pennies, so people know exactly how much they're spending on various different things and how much money they actually have to spend on something. So yes, so I mentioned already about the meter, but we also have come across quite a lot about forced walking. And there's been a lot, particularly during the pandemic early on, there was a lot of focus on active travel, and that's something that has come up as a kind of policy measure for some time now, that it's really healthy for you if you do active travel, and particularly thinking about cycling and walking. But we actually have come across that a lot of people are actually forced to walk because they don't have either access to public transport or they can't afford it, and this can actually have quite detrimental impacts as well. So it's not always necessarily the healthy option, particularly thinking about if it's really cold outside and you have to walk to the shop and then you have to carry your weekly shop with you, and it might then cause you physical problems, particularly if you might already have underlying health issues. So we found a lot about forced walking, but also a lot about forced car ownership, which is people having to actually own a car because they don't have any other options. Either they, like Neil mentioned, they might live in a rural area where there's no transport links, and then they are forced to own a car, and that car ownership might actually push them into poverty because they can't keep up with all the payments. So what's really come up in our sort of interview data is this kind of constant juggling and having to prioritize between different things. And it's not really like, I'm not saying this lightheartedly, it is really about people having to make decisions that can then affect their life chances quite considerably, and their well-being as well. And on that particular thing, another sort of key sort of thing that came up to us on the interviews is this kind of concept of almost like missing out on things. So people mentioned that, they were missing out on key appointments, for example, so they couldn't go to the hospital because they would have had to take a taxi to get there, and it's costing a lot of money to take a taxi. And, there were sort of these kind of missed appointments, missed healthcare appointments, sometimes even missed school or college lectures because people didn't have the means to travel there. So a lot of those sort of like, missing out, which then in return, that's kind of again limits people's sort of other options for accessing key services. And it's really interesting actually because we didn't obviously, we didn't know that COVID was going to happen, and we designed this project before COVID was even an issue. And one of the things that during COVID has kind of been a lot in the media and a lot in sort of people have been, saying that we can't travel and we're being really restricted. And in our data set, the staying at home for a lot of people was really hard and really difficult. A lot of people have lost jobs, and as a result of that, they've been pushed into fuel poverty and transport poverty. But also there were a lot of people that actually were not traveling even before the pandemic. So I think we have to kind of remember that this sort of situation where we are restricted by travel actually is a day-to-day sort of life for a lot of people who actually didn't have the opportunity even before that. Really, sorry?
Okay, can you come to the conclusions?
Yes. So really sort of thinking about, big impacts on the quality of life. Neil, can you do that in 1 minute?
Yeah, I'll be super quick. I'll skirt over this. So this is just us thinking about, okay, connecting what we've done to debates around net zero transition, and how can we address double energy vulnerability in that transition. I haven't got much time, but I will just say that a fairly obvious point, we really think a fair transition needs to recognise, account for, and actively seek to try and mitigate both transport and energy poverty, because at the moment it feels like they're sort of excluded from the conversation, really. And we also wonder, or think it could make sense to actually think about and try and address transport poverty and energy poverty sort of simultaneously. So often they're sort of seen as separate problems and addressed through separate policy packages, but could we actually go further and try and address them both simultaneously? And it'd be interesting to have a discussion really about what type of policy packages could maybe try and do that. And Mari, I'm going to hand over to you again, because I know we're quite a bit over now.
Thanks, Neil. So just really quickly, one of the things that we've been thinking about in this project, particularly also, is that, how can we actually have a net zero transition that addresses vulnerabilities in our society? And one of the things that I think is that, can a net zero transition actually address these? And we are seeing a lot of these really pre-existing structural inequalities in the UK. And it does require sort of really fundamental societal change if any of this is going to happen, because there are a lot of these issues that aren't as there. And obviously it's the basic things like, making sure that everyone has a decent home and decent transport options. And it is really about income, but it's also about infrastructure and, having decent housing conditions and transport provision as well. So, and lastly, I wanted to say that, it really matters who is designing these transitions and what are the key objectives in that sense. So I'll leave it there. And just really quickly, I wanted to show you that we have a massive team in this project. I'm very grateful for all of them. So, so thank you so much.